The Renaissance was a period in the history of Europe spanning from the 14th to the 17th centuries AD. Renaissance is a French word meaning rebirth. The period is called by this name because at that time people started taking an interest in the learning of ancient times, in particular that of ancient Greece and Rome. The Renaissance was seen as a rebirth of that learning. The Renaissance is often said to be the start of the modern age. As Europe shifted from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, the daily life of the average person changed as well. People began to enjoy more luxuries, nicer clothes, finer foods, and the arts. There were more craftsmen, artisans, and merchants who developed into a middle class of people who had sufficient money to keep themselves from poverty. The typical home for a poor farmer was a one-room hut, but wealthier merchants began to live in larger and more spacious homes. These homes, while relatively luxurious, would have been damp, cold, and dark compared to today's standards. Running water was a pipe dream, and bathrooms were virtually non-existent. During the Renaissance, religious leaders had a great deal of influence on government and other aspects of public and private life. The Catholic Church grew during this time, its leaders were getting richer and the church was growing in number and wealth. Christianity as a whole, however, was still seeing a decline from the bubonic plague in the early stages of the Renaissance. It was possibly because of this that philosophies like humanism became more popular. Employment was average during the Renaissance. Most people had jobs, but a large number of these were very low paying, meaning that not many people had money to spare. Those who had talent, such as a certain William Shakespeare, would make plenty of money and, provided they didn't squander it, also lived a lavish life. This caused a great distinction between those who were worse off and those who were better off. You either had money and lived the high life, or had no money and lived in poverty. A typical woman would stay at home and look after the household, children, and cooking. Women didn't have the rights they have today, and the husband was very much in charge of the house. The wife's role was to overlook cooking and other preparations and to make sure that a tight budget was kept while simultaneously showing off her and her husband's wealth. Their assumed role was to look pretty beside the husband, and it was expected that they wouldn't even consider a career. Spain and England had monarchies, or kings and queens, as their heads of state. In the case of England, Queen Elizabeth ruled the country from 1558 to 1603, the time of her death. Under her rule, England received over 300 proclamations that governed their lifestyle. A pattern observed in most monarchies of this era was that the people tended to follow the example of their leader obsessively. For example, when Queen Elizabeth's teeth rotted from consuming too much sugar, her loyal subjects painted their teeth black to copy her. There was a large enforcement of the division between the numerous social classes: the monarch, nobility, gentry, merchant, yeomanry, and labourers. The monarch, leader of the country and their royal subjects. This class was exclusive to the royal bloodlines. The nobility. The noblemen and knights made up the nobility class, which governed England's upper class. The gentry. The gentlemen and gentlewomen made up the rest of the upper class, being defined as those who didn't have to work for a living. They were the most important class in society owing to their wealth and the numbers to which they grew. The merchant and yeomanry. The middle class of society consisted of the merchants who exploited new advances in commerce and trade, and the yeomanry who, while not poor, were always on the brink of poverty. The labourers, the artisans, masons, anyone who did their work with their hands belonged to the labourer class. Poorest of them all, this class did the majority of the work for the country.
Known as the Freedmen's Bureau, was established by Congress in March of 1865, right before the end of the Civil War. The Bureau was responsible for every aspect of the lives of 4 million former slaves. Major General Oliver O. Howard, the commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau, was sympathetic to freed people. But he had to contend with Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who had become president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. When President Johnson began issuing pardons and returning land to former Confederates, Howard defied him and ordered his agents to reserve confiscated and abandoned land for the formerly enslaved. But President Johnson overrode Howard's directive. Howard himself went to deliver the bad news to the freedmen, and at the same time he began to create the terms for labor contracts. Howard delayed the signing of contracts 2 months in the hopes that the new Republican Congress would find a way for former slaves to become landowners. Congress refused, and a majority of the Southern land returned to the white elites. In the summer of 1872, Congress shut the Freedmen's Bureau down.
When President Lyndon Johnson launched his war on poverty in the 1960s, he pledged to eliminate poverty in America. But more than 5 decades, several welfare programs, and $25 trillion later, the welfare system has largely failed the poor. Currently, the United States spends about $1 trillion a year on over 90 different federal, state, and local welfare programs. Yet around 12% of Americans are still considered poor. We are clearly spending a lot of money. So why do we still have such a high poverty rate? The simplest answer is that the government does not count most welfare benefits as income when measuring poverty. That means taxpayers can spend and spend, but the poverty rate will always seem to remain unchanged. But does this mean the war on poverty has been a success? Not really. In launching the war on poverty, President Johnson declared that he wanted to address the causes, not just the symptoms of poverty. He said he intended to shrink, not increase, dependence on government. His goal was to increase self-sufficiency, the ability of individuals to support their families without reliance on government handouts, and it penalizes marriage. Work and marriage clearly raise incomes, but more importantly, both are inherently linked to a person's well-being and happiness. For example, marriage is the #1 factor in promoting upward mobility for children. Single mothers were discouraged from marrying the fathers of their children because that reduced their benefits. And as the role of the father was undermined, mothers were increasingly left to raise their children on their own. Sadly, that cycle continues today, as many children who grow up on welfare eventually follow in their parents' footsteps when they have families of their own.
The United States is the world's richest country. It is also one of the most unequal. 40 million people live in poverty. That's around 12% of the population. It has the highest poverty rate in the rich world. And 3 men own as much wealth as the bottom half of the population. The good news is that poverty has decreased over the past 2 years. But income inequality has increased, resulting in a growing gap between the rich and the poor. Although the cost of living varies from state to state, the poverty line is currently set at an annual household income of $25,100 for a family of 4. The wealthiest states are coastal, with the South having a higher concentration of poorer states. In Mississippi, around 20% of people live below the poverty line. That's the highest percentage of any state in the country. In New Hampshire, it's less than half that. California and Missouri have around the same percentage, whereas poverty in neighboring Virginia and West Virginia is poles apart. Poverty rates can wildly vary between towns within states. Take Paris, Texas, which has a rate of 41%, while in neighboring Reno, it's just 3%. The wealth divide can also be seen fluctuating between blocks and even streets. In different blocks on separate sides of Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn, New York, the poverty rate is 6 times that of the other. Poverty in America is not only geographical, it's also racial. African Americans are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than white Americans. But it's Native Americans who have the highest poverty rate of any race in the country, and this is even higher for those who live on reservations. Poverty declined in the majority of states in 2017. Income growth, welfare programs, and more jobs have led to the decline. But if the incomes of the top 1% continue to grow faster than those of the other 99%, the gap between the rich and the poor will continue to widen.